Radio TV phono nut here, and you might remember this Plamor tube radio that we resurrected probably a year or more ago. All we basically did to it was reform the filter capacitors, replace the power cord, and put an antenna wire on it, and it started playing. Well, it's still playing, but as you can hear with the volume turned down, we're starting to get some what sounds like 60 cycle hum, so it may be time to replace those old filter caps now.
Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and a lot of people haven't forgotten. A lot of people don't like the disruption factor.
And as you might recall, this is the set where whoever worked on it before me obviously thought that chassis installation bolts were optional because they only used one. So yeah, this is probably going to be another time, since this chassis is so spacious, that we're going to put a terminal strip right here in this area, put our new capacitors on it, and run wire from the terminal strip to the respective places in the circuit. Now, in this particular instance, our filter capacitors are a common positive, so when you run into a radio this age, or any tube radio for that matter, you always want to be careful with that when replacing the capacitors, because in not all cases will they be common negative, especially models made before World War II. Alright, that concludes our filter capacitor replacement. We soldered a terminal strip to the chassis. We attached the capacitors to the terminal strip, and then we ran wires as neatly as possible from the terminal strip to the respective places in the circuit where the capacitor needs to go. And like I said in the first video, modern day 22 microfarad capacitors are a lot smaller than 1940s era 22 microfarad capacitors. But somehow I doubt these more modern electrolytic capacitors will last as long as what the old ones did. And you can see the little bit of crust on that one and on that one as well.
Change your life the way it
okay, that got rid of 100% of the hum. That's with the volume down, no hum.
And I'm feeling so good after losing over 50 pounds. Call PhD Weight Loss today, 864-644-1900. Call 864-644-1900.
Now when I turn the volume up, sometimes it kind of wants to snap and pop in the audio. Which we might want to look into that while we're here.
So many reasons to try Balance of Nature, but I've got one now you cannot ignore. Let's review some of the... They can provide you with so many of the things you may be missing. Third, it could be just what...
Okay, value-wise, this is reading 25 microfarad on capacitor number 1. The number 2 reads 26, which is close to the same. Let's check it from... Alright, on the old school tester, it shows about 40 microfarad. But we have about a 15% power factor on here, so that's a little bit off. Now let's check it for leakage. Nothing on, and no leakage on 200 volts. Well, this one checks about the same for power factor and capacitance value. Let's check it for leakage. Nothing there. Okay, that one shows some little bit of leakage, but the light did go out, so not terribly bad. Cap 1 has an ESR of about 2 ohms, although not perfect, but I've seen a lot worse. And cap number 2 is a bit worse at almost 5 ohms ESR. So you would think by checking these on equipment that they would still be good enough to filter, but apparently not. Now, obviously they weren't totally inoperative, because if they were, the hum would have been a lot louder than it was, but they were dying. So I guess this is just another one of those situations where what it all boils down to is the best test for a capacitor, if one is suspected, is another capacitor. Now, there are a couple of common things that can fail that can cause random crackling and popping in your audio, and old carbon composition resistors that are breaking down and arcing internally can do it, and the same thing can happen to capacitors. So look for any capacitors that have high voltage on one side, such as this biplate bypass cap on the detector tube. It connects between the plate and the cathode of said tube. Excuse me, not the detector tube, the RF amplifier tube. Checking it here, we're getting some puny little blurry eye opening. Let's see how it tests for leakage. Well, that looks pretty good on the low range. We're getting some leakage, but it's not as bad as it could be. I'm going to go ahead and replace it, but it's, like I said, not as bad as what it could be. Okay, I've got that capacitor replaced, and I'm checking between the cathode of the output tube and our control grid, and I've got negative 11.6 volts in respect to cathode on our control grid, so that coupling capacitor is probably okay. However, this capacitor here across the AC line probably needs to be replaced for good measure. And this AC line capacitor is a little bit warm to the touch, so that means it's leaky and needs to go. Alright, I've replaced that across the line capacitor, and I'm just barely getting a little twitch from the eye as far as the value. Let's see about the leakage. Well, nothing there. Yep, on second thought, there is a little something there at the lowest range. And then, of course, the more voltage we apply, the leakier it's going to be. And at 400 volts, its rated voltage, it's acting like a dead short.
Contractors and are involved in the daily.
Okay, there we go. We're playing, and so far, no popping.
Their mission is to provide
between those two capacitors, it was probably the one across the AC line that was arcing internally and getting ready to short, which was causing the popping that I was hearing earlier in the audio. Alright, lifting the grid end of the coupling capacitor and testing it for the presence of DC. Came up to about 2 volts among first power up, and then it dropped down to, we're down to 0 volts now. So that capacitor is in pretty decent condition, but that's one of the newer solar seal tight caps from after the war ended. All the others in here are the old style, and those tend to leak more than the later ones do. And just for an experiment, we ran the same test with a new capacitor, and what I anticipated would happen, we got about a couple of volts upon immediate power up, and then it dropped down to 0 volts, just like the solar seal tight did. So the solar seal tight is still doing its job just fine. Okay, so the solar seal tight is back in position, and I think we're about to a point where this Plamor radio is ready to play some more until the next time it fails, and then when that happens, we'll deal with it then. Alright, we're back together, and we'll just let it play until something goes wrong again. Alright, I need to correct a mistake I made. I said that cap was from the plate to the cathode of the RF amplifier tube. It's actually not. This actually is the detector tube, 6C6.
That was
And the RF amp tube, this one is the 6D6.
Just a different.
I can touch the grid cap of that and get signal increase. I can touch the grid cap of the detector tube and get audio amplification there. So yeah, these are kind of in a different order. I just took for granted this would be our RF, this would be the detector, this over here audio output, this tube here rectified, but they're switched in this particular set. Fortunately, there is a schematic for the radio pasted on the bottom of the cabinet. And here's the capacitor we replaced. It connects between the plate of the detector tube and the cathode, which the cathode connects to ground. Here's another capacitor shown on the schematic that we probably should look at, a screen grid bypass cap. Right now it doesn't seem to be causing any problems, but those have been known to short. And of course, if that happened, that would short the screen voltage to ground, but I don't think it would really blow anything up because we have this 2 meg resistor here. That resistor might get a little toasty, but I don't really see anything being destroyed. Alright, and then this 0.01 from the plate of the detector tube to the control grid of the output tube, that's the solar seal tight cap that we determine that there's nothing wrong with. And let's see what else is here. We have this antenna isolation cap. You know, it wouldn't be a bad idea to replace that for good measure. That's a safety measure more than anything else, because the bottom end of the primary winding on this antenna transformer connects to ground, and since this is a line operated set, then if that capacitor wasn't there, somebody could grab the antenna, and if they were in contact with ground, then they could receive a nasty shock or worse. We have this other cap on the 6D6, a 0.02 between the cathode and ground. Really no voltage to amount to much there, so really no danger with that. This capacitor from one side of the AC line to chassis, we replaced that, and it was getting a little warm, so we know that was leaky. So actually, on this particular set, these ground symbols, that's indicative of chassis ground in this case. B minus is this line right here. And like I said, we have a common positive filter cap. And then the negatives, one end connects to the chassis, and then the other end connects to one end of the speaker field coil, and then the other end of the speaker field coil goes back up here, connects to a voltage divider network, which consists of a 35 ohm resistor to ground, and then a 4 meg resistor up here. That's how they're getting the bias voltage. They had some kind of weird ways of accomplishing that back in the 30s. And then it looks like we have another capacitor on the cathode of our output tube. They don't even list a value of it. It just says /200 volts. So, and I don't even recall seeing that when I had the set apart. Maybe we'll pull it apart again and look at it closer. And yes, that's the urban gospel station playing in the background, which is an indication of how bad programming is on AM this time of day. Really, AM programming around here goes from bad to worse. At this time of the day, you've got sports programming, the same crap on both 1010 and 1450. and that's probably my least favorite programming. I'd rather sit around and watch paint dry than listen to that crap. And 1390, the Southern Gospel station, is such bad fidelity that I can't listen to it, so that leaves 910, the Urban Gospel station, and I couldn't listen to that for very long if I was paying close attention to it. So there you go. Well, we're getting WSM on this. Now, one thing I've noticed about this, especially on local stations,
I called Trinity, and I ended up joining based on high credit card bills.
is it sometimes sounds distorted at lower volume, but sounds better at higher volume. That could be just a design of this radio, or there could be a component that is drifted. We'll have to try to determine that here shortly. Now, something I want to show you is this capacitor here that has a strap on it that's soldered to the chassis. Most likely this is two capacitors in one that probably have a common connection to the chassis. It looks like one of them, the end of one capacitor connects to pin, what pin is this? Looks like pin 3 of the 6C6 detector tube, and then the other capacitor lead looks like it connects to, looks like pin 4 of the 6D6 RF amplifier tube. So just to prevent any kind of confusion, let's go look at a schematic and see what that is all about. Alright, on our 6C6 detector tube, we have a 0.02 microfarad cap between the screen grid, pin 3, and the chassis. And then over here on the 6D6 RF amplifier tube, we have another 0.02 cap between the suppressor grid, which is also connected to the cathode and chassis. So that's two 0.02 caps in one, with the strap establishing the chassis connection. So if you ever run into one of those caps with a strap on it, regardless of the radio brand, don't just assume that's for mounting and that it's a single capacitor. Most likely it's going to be two in one, and that strap is used to establish a connection for at least one of the capacitors to the chassis. The best way to not get confused is to get a schematic for your radio and make sure. Fortunately, our radio still has the schematic on the bottom of it, which is a good thing because I haven't found an exact match in riders for this yet. As far as this flashlight I'm using, what this actually is an ultrasonic dog whistle, if you will. It's got a couple of positions on it, plus a flashlight. It's some gimmick that my mother ordered several years ago, and quite frankly, it's about as useless as anything could be as far as getting the dog's attention, but it makes a pretty good little LED flashlight. And I'm just going through and checking some of these resistors, and the way these old dog bone resistors are usually read is body N dot. Easy enough to remember. It spells the word bed. So the body is red, that's 2. End is green, that's 5. And then the dot is orange, that's times 1000. So this is a 25k ohm. And since there's no tolerance band, gold or silver at the end, that indicates this is a 20% resistor. The survey says 26.3K. That's nothing to get alarmed about. Alright, body, red, that's 2. The N looks black, that's 0. and then the dot looks to be brown. So that would be a 200 ohm resistor, and the survey says 178.2 ohms. So also a 20%, so nothing to get alarmed about there. So just to clarify, red 2, black 0, and brown times 10. So 20 times 10 would be 200, and we're reading 178. That's no big deal. Body, red 2, black 0, green times 100,000. That would be 2 megohm. The survey says 2.3. That's a 20% resistor. That's not getting me overly excited either. And I'll tell you something I dislike about some of these modern alligator clip test leads is the boot on them. It's so slick that when you're trying to hold them to clip the thing on something, it slips out of your fingers. Alright, moving on. Green, that would be 5. Black, 0, and yellow. That would be times 10,000, so that would equal 500 k ohms. What's the survey say? The survey says, well, that is down a little bit, 408k. That shouldn't be a problem. That's also a 20% resistor. Like I said, I'm not going to worry about these unless they're just way out in left field. Alright, yellow will be 4, black 0, that might be a green dot. So that would be 4 meg, and it's reading 3.5 meg. I'm not overly concerned about that either. Okay, here's one with a tolerance band on it. The body color is brown 1. The end color to the right looks black. If I'm seeing that correctly, that would be 0. Dot, yellow, that would be times 10k. That would equal a 100 k ohm resistor, and the silver band to the left end of the resistor would be a 10% tolerance. So what's the survey say? 57 k ohms, so that one probably could stand to be replaced because it's definitely out of the plus or minus 10% tolerance. Here's another one if I'm seeing this correctly. Body, red 2, end to the right, black 0, so 20 times our dot, which is yellow, 10,000 ohm, 200k, silver band on the left hand side, 10%, and that one also reads 58k ohms. So those two 10% resistors will probably need to be replaced for best result. Alright, body green 5, end black 0, yellow times 10k, that would be 500k, no color on the other end, so 20%, so 500k, it's reading 392k. So yeah, even at 20%, that's out of bounds, so we probably need to change those 3 resistors. The rest of them I'm not too concerned about. And I was correct. We have 100k and a 200k, and oddly enough, both of them in circuit read 58k. So this is part of that bias network for the output tube, and then coming up we have a paper capacitor and the grid leak resistor that also test off in circuit. Tomorrow I'll lift that capacitor and see if that alters any of our readings. Now, it would be theoretically more accurate to lift one end of each resistor, but doing so is going to transfer heat through the resistor, and that will alter the measured value, at least for a time anyway. Now something else you might need to know, you notice how this is labeled 100M, 200M, 500M. Oftentimes on these older schematics they're labeled that way, and that does not mean megohms. Back then, ohm was usually how they designated k-ohms. If it was a resistor in the megohms, such as this 4 meg here, they would just have it spelled out 4 MEG. And I don't recall seeing that or that 35 ohm resistor in my test. Maybe I need to go back and look and see if I missed something. See, here's a 2 meg resistor, and they have it spelled MEG. So be careful of that too. But yeah, resistor color codes is something we had to learn very early on whenever I was in the electronics program at the local community college. And the way we were tested on them is he would hand us a handful of resistors, and we were not allowed to use a cheat sheet, and we had to write down the value of the resistors. Not patting myself on the back, but I think I probably did better than most anybody in there at that. And whenever we were doing lab work and whatever, it was always them asking me, hey, what color is a 1000 ohm resistor? What color is a 2.2K resistor? Okay, this must be our 4 meg here, and we did measure that, and it's reading 3.5 meg. Not overly concerned about that. And our 35 ohm resistor is this flex ohm job here, which reads right on the money, so no concern about that. I have seen these open before, but generally they're either right on the money or they're wide open, and this one's right on the money. So what we need to be concerned with now are these 3 resistors, the 100K, the 200K, both at 10%, and this 500K ohm grid leak resistor. So some of these 20% resistors were indeed a bit on the borderline, but generally speaking, when they used a 20% resistor in a circuit, that means it's not critical, and it can probably be off way more than 20% and actually still work satisfactorily. When they used a 5 or a 10% resistor, which the latter in our case here, then that means that the circuit has closer tolerances and they need a more precision resistor for best performance. Believe me, they wouldn't have used the more expensive 10% resistor if they thought they could have gotten away with using the less costly 20% resistor. Now, the price difference probably wasn't that much, maybe a couple of cents, but when you times a couple of cents times however many thousands of radios they produce, that can add up. And when you're dealing with a manufacturer that's trying to keep costs down, as far as these little cheap TRF sets, then of course, if they can cut cost and get away with it by using a cheaper, lower tolerance or a lower tolerance part, then they're going to do it. A little earlier, whenever I measured the control grid voltage on the output tube with respect to cathode, I got about 11 volts negative there. The tube manual recommendation, they're saying about 16 volts negative for a tube used in this application. So it'll be interesting to see if when we change those resistors that appear to be out of tolerance, if we have an altered negative grid voltage there. But we'll determine that in just a little while. But right now, this battery, and we need to charge it up so it'll be ready to go when we get back on the radio. Those resistors, I disconnected each one of them and tested them, and out of circuit they test with intolerance. So that was just a case of the three of them interacting with each other in circuit. In tube equipment, we can usually test resistors in circuit and get an accurate enough reading, but there are a few cases where we have to lift one end. That capacitor, I had to disconnect it to get the resistors out anyway, to clear the hole up, to make it easier to get the resistors loose, and I went ahead and checked it, and it's hardly leaking. As you can see here on the tester, that light's blinking away, so I just went ahead and replaced it with a new capacitor and got that out of the way. Okay, our negative grid voltage is about the same, negative 11, but it seems like at low volume we have less distortion than what I was picking up before after I replaced that leaky cap. Alright, seeing what kind of shape this dual capacitor is in on the RF tube. On that end we have 41, almost 42 volts, we'll say, and then on our other end we have almost 47 volts. Alright, I took the ground end of that cap loose, and if it was good I would read no DC on that terminal, but I'm reading about 17 volts, 16-17 volts there. So yeah, that cap's leaky. Now on one section I'm not getting much in the way of an eye opening at all. Let's check it for leakage. Well, yeah, it's got some leakage at 200 volts. And the second section not getting much in the way of an eye opening either. Little leakage at 200 volts. And this one on the volume control is leaky. It's got almost as much DC on the side I took loose as it does on the side on the other side. So we're going to just replace that. Alright, we got that cap replaced, but unfortunately I had to J-hook it because the leads weren't long enough to stretch from point A to point B. But I actually used a new, more rigid piece of wire from one of those, or piece of lead rather, from one of those junky filter caps to put in here on the coil itself. And then I soldered it up really well, and that gave us a very secure bond. It's not going anywhere, and I have the leads of the cap insulated so they can't touch this AC lead on this power switch here.
And you understand, the only
bad.
The only demographic that Kamala Harris captured in the election was single women, single white women. Everybody else voted for Trump. So here's that category of single white women, largely, and here are people who are beyond distraught at recognizing that Donald Trump got a mandate that the American people
let's get on with
elected
the performance
Donald Trump, 47th President of the United States.
I might wake up a mother.
Anyone else helping out? I am 48 years old and I have never experienced anything like this. I never thought I would in this country.
Oh, please.
I was stressed. I don't know how to handle this. I don't know how to get through this. and so does he celebrating. And everyone else, everyone who feels threatened by him is scared. Like, we're scared for our lives, we're scared for our friends. Like, you have pro-life women dying because their doctors are scared to treat them because of the repercussions of his last presidency. How did we get here? How did we get here? To know that there is that much ignorance and that much hate in this country is so terrifying. It's so terrifying. How could you do this? How can you claim to be a Christian or anyone of moral values and support someone with every word out of his mouth to hate when he wants to pardon people who took over the Capitol? Do not do this to people that you love and care about. If you have a woman in your life, if you have an LGBTQ person in your life, if you have anyone in your life who's not white, how did we get here? Someone tell me, please. Someone really tell me, please.
I have a very good friend who is gay.
Like either he cheats and that was his secret, or this country is built on so much hate, and we might never get out of this. If you voted for him, you are dead to me. I really don't. I really don't. Alright, guys, it's time to go to bed. None of us are stressed about the election, right? We all are gonna just go have the best night, the best night's sleep of our lives, aren't we?
I'm trying not to be, again, mean-spirited. I don't want.
Well, all you crying women, don't worry. I'm sure Trump will still let you wear your mask while you're driving in your car by yourself. So nothing for y'all to really get in a uproar about there.
Well, real to them, they recognize no election is running. See, none of those people care about how we've responded to being on the losing end of elections. And I tried to tell some of my friends who frankly were kind of similarly upset. America is a pendulum. And look, if Trump and Republicans don't deliver, then the pendulum will swing back. If the Democrats figure out that their brand of extremism over the last few years can't work, and they become moderate, they pivot towards the center, they absolutely could win again. So, to those who are 48 years old, like that one person on the clip, look, you got to shake yourself up. You got to shake yourself, shake it off, dust yourself off, let your voice be heard, but don't let any election take you to that state, because it's not healthy for you, and it's certainly not healthy for the people around you. Elections are elections. There are things that are even
okay, I need to take the speaker out because this cabinet needs some wood glue clamps in the worst kind of way, and then we ought to be about done with this. Speaker looks to be in great shape, no cracks, no dragging voice coils, so we need to glue this cabinet back together. And I'm trying to glue the parts of the cabinet back that have come loose, and talk about J-Clegg Central here. I was able to get this separated enough to dribble some glue down in here, and then I put a clamp on it to hold it together. Well, I thought I could glue this together up here and then take my other clamp that's not as big as this one here and clamp the cabinet together, but it wasn't big enough, so since our brace was still affixed to the side of the cabinet, I was able to take a smaller clamp and managed to carefully, with the aid of an old paper capacitor, clamp that together, so maybe when this dries, I can at least pick up the cabinet without worry of it falling apart. But yeah, these old clamps is stuff that I think were carryovers from my dad's woodworking days. And when he passed away, Mama got rid of most of his stuff, including some very long pipe clamps that if I'd have known 27 years ago what I know today, we wouldn't have got rid of those pipe clamps because they would have come in handy for gluing these cabinets back together. But back then, I wasn't really running into that many cabinets that needed to be glued back together, so I wasn't thinking that far in advance. There's one other thing we need to check before we button this back up. It's kind of bright out here. It's causing a lot of glare, but there's the here's the antenna coil isolation cap here, and just to look at it, it looks like a mica cap, but it might not be, because back then there were some paper caps that looked like micas. So the best way to determine if we need to replace this or not is test it for leakage, and if it's mica, it probably won't be leaky. But if it's paper, it'll come near being leaky, although I have run into some mica caps that were leaky before. But let's find out. Okay, let's see. Okay, nothing there. Nothing there. Got a little something there, but we don't know if that's the tester, because this thing sometimes blinks when there's no leakage. So, okay, let's undo the capacitor and see if it continues to blink. Okay, so it's not blinking, so it's not my tester being overly sensitive. Okay. Now is it not going to blink? Okay, that's at 400 volts. And it's blinking. Disconnect the cap, and the blinking goes away. So that cap is a bit leaky. Alright, there's our new capacitor in place. And I notice on this rectifier tube, which is a Raytheon replacement, it says on there, for replacement use only. As in, do not use it in original equipment, or we will come break your legs. And we can tell that this one has had a lot of hours on it by the amount of burn off on the tube, top of the tube. So, yeah, I'd say somebody loved this radio. Okay, so I'm about ready to put the chassis back in the cabinet. And we replaced all of the capacitors except one, the grid coupling cap. And the reason we didn't replace it is because electrically I'm finding no reason to replace it. It's already a replacement, and it still tests perfectly okay. Now, I could go ahead and replace it, but we have to leave at least one old cap in there just to make the compulsive cap changers wet their diaper, so we'll leave it alone. But everything else, all the other caps I replaced, but I believe I showed where I had a reason to replace them. Alright, we're back together, and I'm holding onto the antenna wire with the volume wide open. We're getting 670 very faintly, not really loud enough to listen to, but it's definitely there, which is saying something for one of these little dinky 4T TRF sets. Seems like 910 has an audio issue this morning. That sounds pretty distorted.
Too soon, because we've seen the cabs even last year.
That's 1010. It sounds okay.
Too soon.
On all sides, the ongoing now.
That's 1390 with their usual
early signs,
background hash.
Cabinet picks and things like that.
If you look at that,
and then there's 1450.
Well,
I think 14 to know how many days
Is it going to be
that are
you have 1390 bleeding over on top of it, and that's because this is a TRF radio that's not very selective, and it's also because with the issues that 1390 is having, they're kind of spreading out a little bit, if you get my drift.
If you let the Cleveland Cavaliers, man, get out to 20-game lead or whatever the case may be on the East, I mean, that's going to be tough to overcome going down.
But Saturday and Sunday really suck for AM radio in my area because your options are pretty much urban gospel, southern gospel with all the hash on top under it, and sports. And I forget, on Sunday afternoon, 10-year-old reruns of the public interest show that 1010 used to run.
What do you think the lifespan of the Jimmy Butler era is going to be?
But all we need to do to this now is replace the dial bulb, and we don't need to hold up this video for that. Next time I order some parts, I'll get some dial bulbs, and I've got several radios that need dial bulbs. And
emo hair, he came with the media day last year. Like, Pat Riley is not with all the extras, and Tyler Hero is the guy that's making Jimmy expendable right now, because Tyler Hero's having a great year for Miami.
And when it comes to this mica antenna coil isolation cap, and it is mica, it says so on the container. This also protects the antenna coil from something stupid like someone applying AC across the antenna terminals. And the reason I say that is you might remember a video we did a few years ago on a battery set where some dimwit attached an AC power cord directly across the antenna and ground terminals, and had it not been for that capacitor in line with the antenna terminal, they would have vaporized the antenna coil by doing that. So this is not really going to have any effect on performance. It's just mainly a safety feature.
Not podcast, T.
And I just put this on my shelf with old style components just for a visual reference. Certainly not going to try to use this in anything, but we can put it with all my other old components. Yeah, I don't know what that is with 910, but it sounds like they've got some kind of, I don't know if that's some kind of digital artifact or what, but
a night of game. That's what you want.
Okay, I dug around in my junk and found some screws to hold the chassis in place. Now, they're a bit mismatched, but they get the job done. And that's always been a pet peeve of mine. When you take a radio apart for servicing it, just put the chassis bolts or screws or whatever it uses in a little cup so you don't lose them. And then whenever you put the radio or whatever back together again, then you've got all of the screws to reassemble it. But you'd be surprised how many. In fact, I probably get more radios than not that are missing some of the chassis screws, if not all of them. As far as the sound quality of AM in my area, none of the 4 stations sound top-notch. Now, some sound better than others, but if you listen to them closely, you can tell deficiencies with all of them. Which brings up a point. Back in the day when AM radio was king, most stations were on top of their game. And if there was even the slightest technical deficiency, there was an engineer there to take care of it. But back in those days, the FCC stayed on top of all broadcast mediums, and you never knew when Uncle Charlie was going to stick his head in the door to do an inspection. So not only were stations concerned about the audio quality that their listeners heard, they were also concerned that they didn't want the FCC coming in and fining them if they found any technical deficiencies. Nowadays, I don't think the FCC really cares that much about AM.
Now there's another one.
In fact, I feel like the only reason they haven't killed it off is because they can't sell the AM spectrum, AM broadcast band spectrum, like they did the TV broadcast band spectrum. If they thought they could make $1 off of the AM broadcast band, they would have shut it down and sold off the space years ago. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm glad they haven't shut it down, because even though the content in my area pretty much sucks for quality, at least there's still something to demonstrate that the radio still works. And at least at nighttime, there's still one or two stations like WSM and WDIA that I can receive that play music, with WSM being the most consistent. Here in the wintertime, or approaching wintertime, it's not quite winter yet, but WSM starts coming in here around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and at that time they're playing more modern country. I just really don't understand why WSM doesn't switch to 100% classic country, because you know there are other stations in the Nashville area that's playing more modern country music. Why WSM feels like they have to devote airtime to that crap is beyond me. They need to just stick with the older stuff and let the FM stations play the newer tractor rap. But for the time being, our radio is playing very well for a little dinky TRF set. And if anything happens to it that causes it to cease playing, then we will address that issue when the time comes.
Term insurance may only cost you about $2.
910 still sounds kind of crappy.
Type 2 diabetes, or overweight, or have high blood pressure.
1010, sometimes you can hear, I don't know how to describe it. It's like static that is in phase with the modulation that you can hear, that varies with the modulation.
Lou will make sure the scales are tipped in your favor. Call 800-529.
And then 1390 has this hash in it that is more noticeable when you tune left or right of center of the station.
And now Friday here. The scripture word begins with the Beatitudes, blessing for those who exhibit godly character in Matthew 5.
Secretary and previously served in the Trump White House as the assistant press secretary.
And then 1450, they sound pretty good, but their audio level doesn't seem to be as high as the other stations.
1390@gmail.com. That's WMER 1390 zip code and phone number. Any answer without this information will be disqualified. Your data will not be sold or given to any person or any organization, and you may submit an answer multiple times up to Monday morning at 7 a.m. following the previous week's clue. With the correct answer, you have a chance to win $100 worth of groceries from Piggly Wiggly of Collinsville.
And you're listening to WMER Radio, 93.1 FM, or 1390 AM, your hometown good news gospel radio in Meridian, Mississippi.
Okay, that's about all I've got for this video.
In the zone on it, maybe not focused on it, but they're hearing it and they're noticing it.
I hope you got something out of all of this, and hopefully we'll do some more later.